Today we are joined with Dr. Sumeet Mhaskar. Today our discussion will focus on the topic of caste census in India.
So, as far as census is concerned in general, it has been conducted historically by all kinds of rulers across the world. So, the British colonial state also wanted this information on how to govern this large population in South Asia. Why did it stop? The reason, of course, for this was that this creates division in the society because that is a data that cannot be challenged. That they probably have an opinion that they don't want reservation, they don't like reservation, but this is something a government official should not have done. Of the total 100 jobs that have been there, even in 1950, maximum 8 jobs were part of what we consider as a proper jobs with social security provisions. So even in 1950, the reservation was applicable only to, let's say, 5 jobs. 95 jobs in this country was always outside the purview of reservation. So right now the share has gone down.
In order to provide social justice, having some reservation policies for the private sector as well, do you see that at all?
The economic mobility does not guarantee that you will not get discriminated, either in social sphere or in any other, either you go to the marriage kind of situation or even in general housing situation.
The marginalized class have not been able to be taken above, say, both in terms of education, employment, the representation has not been sufficient enough.
Upper caste making fake certificates. Yeah. That is a true phenomena. Why doesn't the government, let's say, criminalize those people who have actually misused that opportunity? There is a hatred towards reservation. So delimitation, what are the ways one can do? What are the ways one can actually balance this political representation problem? That needs to be really discussed.
Welcome to another episode of the Coffee House Experience. Today we are joined with Dr. Sumeet Mhaskar. So Dr. Sumeet Mhaskar is a professor of sociology at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, OP Jindal Global University. He earned his doctorate in sociology from the University of Oxford in the UK and holds MA and MPhil degrees in political science from JNU New Delhi. He is also the recipient of prestigious research fellowship awarded by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. His distinguished career includes fellowships at renowned institutions such as the Max Planck Institute for Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, Stanford University, and many more. He has published many research in peer-reviewed journals, edited books, and working papers. He writes occasionally opinion pieces for newspapers and magazines such as the Indian Express, the Hindu, Outlook magazine, Hindustan Times, and also for The Wire, etc. So today, welcome, sir, to our experience. Today, our discussion will focus on the topic of caste census in India. So, welcome, sir, to our channel and the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation, Souvik.
So, sir, we can straight away start with, if you could give our audience from a very layman's perspective, maybe on what is a caste census basically. Is it different from the usual census we have? And maybe a bit about the history, that when was the last time. We do know a little bit about it, like 1931 was perhaps the last time it had done a full caste census, but maybe at state level, and why at all it was sort of discontinued. So if you could give a brief about the history of caste census for our audiences.
Yeah. Thank you, Souvik. I think this is, this question has several parts. So maybe we will have to, come back to some of these questions. So as far as census is concerned in general, it has been conducted historically by all kinds of rulers across the world. And one of the reasons the census is conducted is to know the population, because they have to govern the population. They have to govern, they have to redistribute the resources, they have to collect taxes. The rulers also have to take on different kind of projects for the development, or they have to have various kind of policies in modern day languages. Okay. Now, as far as caste and census is concerned, the history goes back to 1872. And this is the first time the British colonial state decided to include, conduct the census in the first place and to include caste in the census. And the kind of information that was gathered did not really include all kinds of various caste groups. And therefore, 1881 is considered as one of the important point as far as inclusion of caste in census. In fact, it also included race, gender, language, region, all kinds of information. So that is the origin as far as the colonial state wanted to include. Now, as I said, all kinds of rulers wanted information to govern the population. So the British colonial state also wanted this information on how to govern this large population in South Asia, what we call. And therefore, they were wondering about what kind of categories that should be included in terms of what kind of information that needs to be gathered. And I think on most fronts, there was less kind of tension, except for caste. But nonetheless, the British colonial state went ahead with the information on caste, and they continued this exercise with kind of variations till 1931. The reason we call that as the last one is because 1941, we were in the kind of middle of the war, and therefore the census data is not necessarily considered as credible. And therefore, we take 1931 as the last point for the inclusion of caste information. Now, that's as far as the history is concerned in terms of why this is collected. And as I said, despite debates, the point itself was the British wanted to govern the population, and they also felt that this is an important piece of information which can be used and misused in all ways, different ways, which happens across the world. So this is nothing new. Now, the second part is, why did it stop? It stopped because by the time 1951 census came, like for the time to conduct that census, India had already gotten independence. And one of the arguments, like there are several arguments that were given to discontinue the census. One was that we should discontinue this British legacy, that this is a colonial legacy, that this is something that the British were doing, and we should not do it. The reason, of course, for this was that this creates division in the society. And India had already gone through a partition of the country, and there were religious violence among Hindus and Muslims. And so this was a particular backdrop against which we were going for the first census after independence. And therefore, the argument was we should more focus on the idea of the unity of this country, and we should not gather information which might disrupt this unity. Now, that is kind of the stated purpose, that we are a modern nation now, we are beginning as a new nation, and therefore we should get rid of these kind of information, which anyway is considered as backward, and we don't really need that. We need to be seen as a modern nation. And modern nation doesn't require this information. But the unstated purpose is also clearly that in the post-colonial leadership, after independence, that is, they realize that these kind of information will also create regular tensions and pulls and pressure in politics, but more importantly on the resources. Because at the end of the day, the governance is also about redistribution of resources in various kinds.
Sir, so how is it different from, for example, Dr. Ambedkar himself during independence had been part of the, scheduled caste and scheduled tribe reservation. He has been talking about it, and also along with the British government, he wanted a nation where the rights are reserved of special categories. So, I mean, this was already a part of the narrative, right? That even if we are not doing a proper census, but we did have a fair idea of, say, maybe what are the back OBC class or the SC or the
Mhm.
caste or the scheduled tribes. So that data was anyway sort of also there, right? Even if it were not through a proper census. Was it the case, or it was like it was completely disintegrated sort of data?
No, as I said, the government of India decided to abandon this kind of column altogether in all kinds of government related surveys or any information that is collected by the government of India. So, as far as the census is concerned, only two categories were included. One is scheduled caste and the other is scheduled tribes. And within scheduled caste, all kinds of caste, like the jatis that are part of scheduled caste list, they were also gathered. So, the information that we have for the last 75 years now is we have decadal information on the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes. Like within scheduled caste, each jati specific information that we have. But apart from these two, it did not collect any information on any other jatis, which might be clubbed together under the group called the OBCs, the other backward classes, or the upper caste, or any other group. So we don't have any other information. And the reason for the inclusion of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe was to address the constitutionally mandated reservations in politics, as far as education and employment is concerned. So you needed that information to implement these policies. And therefore, this information was gathered.
Okay. Sir, my second question would be on the front of social justice. So, since you have extensively worked on social justice and also on part of migration, and also, sir, how do you see like this caste census? Does it really help in an equitable distribution of resources or opportunities? Like, are the marginalized communities will actually be benefited out of this census? Are there any broader aspects of implementation to it, or just a caste census is enough to really address something on social justice front?
See, firstly, we have to understand that having information of caste in census is very important because that is the most authentic source of data. Because that is a data that cannot be challenged. Because the various kind of surveys that various governments do in terms of understanding various kind of issues, so surveys don't really take into account the entire population. It's a representative survey, which is also very good because it gives an understanding of the kind of patterns in a society. But when it comes to census, it includes each and every individual living in the country, and therefore that becomes the most authentic source of data. Now, data is required definitely to create policies, like to what kind of groups we should distribute what kind of resources. Now, will that really happen now in terms of social justice? We have to understand that at least for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and then later to a certain extent for the OBCs, there were policies that were created, and it did help to a certain extent. Okay. Of course, one thing we must remember that the policies were never implemented in its full essence. So the administrators, the bureaucrats, the principal of a small college, or all kind of administrators in the universities, or even the employment opportunities that were advertised by the government. If you look at the trends of reservation seats, the most attempt has been to subvert reservation, that is to not implement reservation. So the government itself was not necessarily serious, and so was the administrator very much against these policies, because it is very likely their personal prejudices were brought into their job in the government offices, that they probably have an opinion that they don't want reservation, they don't like reservation, but this is something a government official should not have done. They should have implemented whatever the government policies. But on the political front, in terms of political parties, as well as the administration, it was particularly not implemented. It is much later that we see that the implementation began. So when the implementation began, of course, there are groups who are benefited and there has been a respectable mobility. Now, the other part to your question is, what about the census information now in 2025, 26, whenever this is out? Now, this is what I have also written and I have also spoken elsewhere. And that is that as far as the welfare dimension is concerned, there are at least two welfare dimensions. Okay, one is education and the second is employment. Of course, one can go about in land redistribution and other kind of policies. But even if we take two aspects, employment and education, even when if we have this information, there is not much that can be done. Because historically speaking, and this is what people usually mix up and in terms of information, that of the total 100 jobs that have been there even in 1950, maximum 8 jobs were part of what we consider as a proper jobs with social security provisions, like the jobs where you have paid leaves, you have provident fund, you get the absolutely the wages in terms of the one which was stipulated by the government. It takes into account inflation. So all these jobs with better paid employment plus other kind of opportunities, these were only 8, including in the public sector and private sector, or 8 or 9 maximum. Okay, so which means we are talking about an population in the only public sector. So let's say 6 jobs. This is, we are talking 1950. Okay, so only 6 jobs, because there is a common understanding. If you talk to people, they somehow feel that, oh, there are maybe these 100 jobs, and then out of 100 jobs, 50 jobs reservation is applicable. The answer is actually no. So even in 1950, the reservation was applicable only to, let's say, 5 jobs. 95 jobs in this country was always outside the purview of reservation. It had nothing to do with reservation. And within those 5 jobs, then the quota applies, because it was only scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. So we are talking only of 22.5% reservation. Okay. Now, what is the situation of these jobs now, if you look at? So right now, nearly 97 to 98% of jobs are in the private sector.
Right.
Forget about the well-paid jobs. Are only total 5 jobs are well-paid jobs with social security provisions. But 97 to 98 jobs in this country right now are in the private sector. In the 1950s, they were 92%. Right now, it is 97 to 98%. So then we are talking only of 1 or 2 jobs which fall in the government sector of the 100 jobs. And within those 1 or 2 jobs, only reservation will be applicable to one particular position. Which means of the 100 jobs we are talking in this country, reservation is applicable only to that 1% well-paid jobs. So right now the share has gone down. First. Secondly, on class 3 and 4 level, which is where the beneficiary is large, the pool is larger, the government has started contractualization, which means they don't hire anyone on permanent basis. Some facilities are there, but you're not hired as a permanent employee, which means you also don't get any permanent employee benefits. So then we are talking of even further, the share is sliced to 0.5 or some percent. So the entire benefit, the purpose of this, if one has to talk only in terms of social justice, then I'm actually concerned that this may not necessarily happen. Because it will actually cater to very micro minority of population. So social justice might happen on another fronts, which we will talk about. And that's as far as job is concerned. Same thing if you go to higher education particularly. You have massive increase in privatization of higher education. So you have wide-ranging private universities that have come up and they have established themselves in the market. And so the preference for parents is more likely to send their kids to the private educational institutions. And this trend is only going to grow. So therefore, on at least these 2 fronts where social justice could have been achieved, the scope is decreasing like massively. Whatever scope was there now, the scope is going to be very tiny, which is still important, but very negligible.
Here, one question for you mentioned about employment, right? And since privatization is on the rise and most of the jobs are like, I think two sector, probably corporates or either MSMEs, right? Who are the major jobs and many of which are private. Now, do you see in foreseeable future any of the political regimes, like in order to provide social justice, having some reservation policies for the private sector as well? Do you see that at all in the remotest possibility happening, or it's out of the league as of now?
No, I think reservation in private sector has been a demand for at least last 25 years or even more. It is now increasingly gaining attention because, as I said, there is nothing to be really demanded in the public sector anymore. The cake of whatever the share that can be demanded is so tiny that one tends to look towards private sector.
Right.
Now, my concern is, of course, one can talk about social justice there, and one can demand reservation in employment and education in both sector. But the problem is that uh, if the government institutions themselves actually were so militantly against implementing reservations in government sector, which is where you can hold them accountable, it is very difficult to enforce this in the private sector. Jobs, it's almost impossible, honestly speaking. The other option, which actually came up during the UPA 1 or 2 government, is that the corporate lobby themselves came up and said, instead of reservation, we will create entrepreneurs among the marginalized group, among the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. And this is also what the experiment was done in the Madhya Pradesh, which was known as the Bhopal document, which actually decided that a certain proportion of government contracts will be given to these groups, and which did help in creating entrepreneurs from those communities, because the government is the biggest contractor anywhere in the world. Because there are so many infrastructure projects, everything that is there, the government constantly gives projects. And therefore, that is one possibility I see, and through which then one can expect trickle down happening within those groups. But other than that, with jobs, I am actually very, skeptical about what will happen. And same with educational institutions, because again, there will be another 10, 15 years will go in this kind of hostility in terms of whether we can implement or not. Elsewhere, I have suggested that the best way probably for higher education is also that the government provides like large number of scholarships for people from marginalized groups, so that if they get the admission, they have enough resources to go and study in those institutions. That could be one of the ways out.
Maybe just before I move on to my next dimension, do you mean to say that even after this much year, 75 plus years of independence, uh, the marginalized class have not been able to be taken above, say, I mean, both in terms of education, employment, the representation has not been sufficient enough? Or because I mean, very popularly we hear among, especially the upper middle class and all that, okay, sometimes these facilities are misused because sometimes there are, people from upper caste is using this as a, making some other certificates. And also sometimes people who are maybe from the marginalized class but have a very high on the economic front, they have a lot of property and economically they're very well off, but they are all taking these facilities. So is this notion true, or to an extent, or is it like I mean, the general perception is not really in accordance with the data which is there?
No, I think the first part, what you asked about, upper caste making fake certificates, that is a true phenomena. And there are several cases which have been reported. Scholars have also noted that in various factories. So that is not necessarily incorrect. People have, and therefore the perception that misuse can happen. Okay. Now, the thing is that misuse also happens with all kinds of policies. So when we talk of pro-poor policies, misuse has happened because there are people who are not poor, but they will produce certificate of poverty. If you go to any higher educational institutions, there is means cum merit fellowship, and there are people who come from landed families, but they can bring those certificate of having minimum income. And so there will always be a small kind of proportion where that will always misuse. You take whichever kind of scheme. So if one only focuses on those kind of misuses, then we will probably not have any scheme across the world actually. Okay. Now here the problem is actually how does the state respond? How does the government respond to misuses? Why doesn't the government, let's say, criminalize those people who have actually misused that opportunity? If the state decides to criminalize those people and put them behind the bars, you will not have such a problem. Okay, and that can be easily sorted. But then government decides not to. And that is probably a subject for another debate. Now, as far as your other question is concerned, which is a commonsensical kind of knowledge that there is some rich Dalit or there is some upper middle class Dalit, and therefore they think that economic mobility has happened and therefore that person does not require reservation. And in fact, the answer lies within this question itself, that for them, they are socially still down. They may have made an economic mobility, which means that at least for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, the economic mobility does not guarantee that you will not get discriminated, either in social sphere or in any other, either you go to the marriage kind of situation or even in general housing situation. Mm-hmm. So they themselves are admitting that these are actually lower caste or untouchables or Dalits. And how come they have these kind of facilities? And if they have, technically this should not be there. Okay. And it has been historically established that Dalits or tribals, despite their economic mobility, they actually face discrimination. There are, presidents or prime ministers, or prime minister we never had one, but also chief ministers, when they sometimes enter the temple, one of the big temples, the temple is purified. The recent example is that of the Chief Justice of India, Gawai, who went to Maharashtra and the bureaucracy did not follow the basic protocol of being there. And he expressed his concern that it's not about him, it's about respecting the chair. So these kind of discriminatory practices have not disappeared. If that was the case, we would not have actually required reservation for scheduled caste who are economically upwardly mobile. But that proportion is also negligible. Okay. The other part, what I would like to highlight here, is that there are certain kind of policies where you require certain amount of economic resources, that the government itself has programs where they have fees of certain amount. Now, if they even exclude those Dalits who have whatever middle class or upper middle class income, then those seats will also remain vacant. So the idea is that, of course, first of all, you have to understand that psychologically, if you look at, there is a hatred towards reservation.
Right.
And therefore, you pick up, kind of different incidences that, okay, there is some rich. Now, the part here is that you're comparing a rich, let's say rich or upwardly mobile Dalit with a poor Brahmin or poor upper caste. That is a wrong comparison in the first place. You should compare that upwardly mobile Dalit with an upwardly mobile upper caste and to see, do they both have similar life choices? And the answer is no. And same with a poor Dalit and a poor Brahmin or a poor upper caste. Are they actually on equal footing? The answer is no. And I think this is where the kind of confusion lies, because also it's also through media. It's also through different kind of jokes. So the kind of perception about reservation being used or misused is primarily done through different kind of mediums. Yeah, and that's why this kind of perception remains in the society.
Right. Yeah, I think it's an important point to make so that it's clear, because a lot of things happens on populist, agenda driven or something spread through social media. So yeah. So my next question was, this, if we come back to caste census and say that beyond the reservation thing, or beyond welfare politics, how do you see this caste census beneficial in other realms, maybe in society or policy development or for the state, to use this data for something which is beyond providing reservation, providing something direct benefit?
Yeah.
What are the other aspects do you foresee?
Yeah, no, this is a very important question actually, because much of this debate on caste and census is sadly being looked at only as a social justice concern, which it is. And there one has to look at in terms of political representation and the redistribution of economic resources. Okay. But beyond that, there is also concern, which I think is important, is something called about the ratio of the population in terms of the male and female population. Right now, there is massive discrepancy, which means that there are more male than female, which is a big problem. And the problem lies in female infanticide. That is, the girl child is killed at birth, sometimes before birth as well, by various kind of testing mechanisms, which the government of India has actually banned. And so definitely, because we have information on the sex ratio in terms of how many men and male or female we have, we know that there are certain regions in this country, the ratio is extremely acute, which means the ratio of women is much lower than that of men. So for every 1,000 male, there are 600 women or 700 women. Haryana being the classic example. But this particular tendency of female infanticide, that is killing the girl child at birth, is spread across the country. But is it also a problem of communities? Some initial observations suggest that only the landed communities have these kind of problem acute. So I think maybe through the caste and community data, we will also know that this kind of problem is also prevalent among certain communities more than others. And the state, that is the government, has a responsibility to correct this error. That this needs to be corrected for any other country if such kind of imbalance is happening. And this is actually a crime. This is not something about, okay, by default, there are more men and less women. This is actually a crime that is happening, that the female child is killed at birth. And if that is a problem, so that needs to be sorted. So that's definitely beyond policy. As far as, one of the examples, there could be many in terms of also land redistribution. One can go in various directions as far as this information is concerned. It's not just about policy, because the government also needs to know what kind of people we have. And if this kind of problem persists in certain groups more than others, then the government can have targeted policies. They can make some awareness in that community about this problem, or whatever ways the government can actually decide to go. And I think this is an important step which actually gets missed out in the discussion, because the entire discussion is so much about social justice. Of course, political representation is an important issue and that needs to be addressed. But in addition to that, the census will open up doors for so many other things. And that needs to be also taken into account.
I think in one of your earlier interviews, you mentioned that rather than caste census, it's caste in census is a better way of putting it, because it's the overall census which is actually giving a lot of depth and granularity, rather than only specifying, okay, I notice some caste and I do some policies. So yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, and on that note also, one thing, it's not about ridiculing anyone, but people and in terms of marital alliances, people are actually putting their caste, their subcaste, their gotras, everything in the newspapers or in the online advertisements. And therefore, this is not something that is so touchy that people don't want to talk about it. You're actually putting your so-called private information for public display, that anyone can actually go in some way and check your profile, at least the online ones. Okay. So which means that as a society, we are not necessarily that much averse that we don't even want to talk about it. You are talking about it. There are all kind of caste associations in urban areas. There are halls, there are temples. These are very much caste associations. named as community, Samaj. Instead of calling it so and so Jati, they call so and so Samaj Hall. And therefore, I think one has to also talk about this aspect that actually there is some material dimension definitely to it, and also political power to it, that actually that disrupts this entire kind of exercise. That you feel that this is not to be done, not because you don't want this to be asked, because this is something you cannot ask, because you ask that all the time anyway, and you also put it across that you want your whatever bride or spouse, whatever groom of this, and which is fine in a way that people are doing that. So therefore this exercise, I think I find it a little more than hypocritical to actually say that we don't want to record that part.
But sir, are you apprehensive, or maybe how do you respond to the critique that it device like it creates divisiveness among the society or deepens it further, asking caste and rather now putting it out on a national scale? So I understand your point that even individually we sort of flaunt or sometimes shy away or maybe put it on private, like every time we discuss it. But maybe when it happens at a national scale, are you apprehensive it would create more social divisiveness, or you are like confident? No, it does. It's just a data collection and more of a that sort of exercise. So what you on that?
No, I think, this is again, we are assuming that somehow we are a homogeneous community. India as a homogeneous community, and there are no social divisions in this country. People in this country have affiliations to a particular jati, they have affiliation to a religion, they are affiliated to a particular sect. Within religion, there are different sects. Within jatis, there are different kind of sect people follow. So I think people already have various kinds of affiliation. There are already divisions. There are already housing societies in urban areas. Sometimes they talk about vegetarianism, but they're actually essentially doing gatekeeping for their own religion, and particularly within religion, that particular caste or subcaste.
Right.
So that division already persists. Violence happens on the basis of on caste, on the basis of religion. For that, the people who do violence, they don't need a data. They already know who lives where.
Yeah.
We are already living in a segregated, by and large, society, rural and urban both. So this is, in a way, taking this argument a little too far to say that it will only produce tensions. Because then we are saying that as if that before this data is disclosed, we don't have any tensions in the society. But the other element to which I would like to, bring your attention is that, yes, it will sharpen certain kind of identities. Sharpen in a sense what? That when you have a sense of marginalization in terms of when you, through the information which is then the most authentic source, that you realize that you, as a community, you should have more claim in this country in terms of either it's in terms of bureaucracy, or in terms of political power, or in terms of economic power, then of course this is going to create frictions. This is a friction between those who are left behind and those who have more, or even more than what their group actually should deserve. And this tension is bound to happen. So when you talk of redistribution, it's never a very smooth or easy exercise. And so this is bound to happen, but any government, particularly we are talking of a democratic government. This is not some authoritarian government we are talking. This is a modern democracy, liberal democracy, where concerns of various groups have to be addressed. And whether it is in terms of economic opportunities, political control, economic control, and which has not really changed much. I mean, what has changed in post-independence India is that you have newer groups that have taken control over or taken more share in terms of politics and economy. And that change definitely has taken place across the country. But still you have what we considered as the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and to a certain extent, the lower OBCs particularly, they have been left behind in a very significant manner. And that is something that needs to be talked about.
Maybe on a different dimension, politically in our political scenario.
Mhm.
So, if we consider, for example, one side BJP and the other side the Congress. So,
Mhm.
in terms of the approach to the caste census, someone may argue that okay, if the BR elections are coming
Mhm.
and it's a time to do a political rhetoric or some
Mhm.
sort of vote bank politics, and hence maybe the right wing, the BJP has like put this into now in that atmosphere that okay, we want to do this caste census and perhaps to as identify with their ideology of Hindutva to strengthen that. On the vis-a-vis, we have the Congress who have also have their own way of looking at this topic. So, do you think like is there any substance to this that the political parties may use it for their benefit for their electorate, or anyway it does not matter?
No, I mean, it matters for political parties. And why not? All political parties essentially want to use some or the other issue to have a leverage in the elections. Now, if this is particularly giving leverage to, let's say, the Rashtriya Janata Dal (RJD), and then the Congress, which is in alliance with Bihar, then of course the BJP was feeling the heat of this issue. That already there was census that was done, and some figures were out, and therefore, as a national data exercise, which is BJP is in power for the last 11, 12 years now, and therefore, if they are not doing, it was going to go against them. Now, by and large, the discourse on caste in census was originally started by the Bahujan politics. You have Kanshiram, then the BSP, and these movements have actually, from 70s onwards, they have been pushing this agenda. Right now, the mainstreamization has happened only in the last 5 to 7 or maybe 10 years maximum, that this issue has been there. And of course, if Congress feels that this is something that will also help them to mobilize the masses in their favor, they are bound to do it. And one thing, of course, we must also understand that we somehow detach the political parties and the population. That somehow political parties, throw some coin or do some magic and people just go and swing. At the end of the day, these political parties are also representing the population. And if they feel that the population is very much going to vote on this issue, then they have to respond. Now, what do they do after the data comes out is actually more interesting. So if one has to really compare Congress or BJP or the Communist Party that ruled in Bengal or Shiv Sena, or you have the AIDMK, DMK, all these political parties that have ruled in different parts of the country, what one will have to do is to do a comparative exercise that having a Congress government is better in terms of implementation of reservation in 50 years? Or is it left government which was ruling 34 years? Have they done actually exceptionally well in terms of implementation? So once we have this data, then we can say that actually, once you have a different ideology, that actually changes a lot. Sachar Commission has shown that actually, as far as whether it's Bengal or other kind of states, actually did not produce good results. Which means that irrespective of ideology, there has been some kind of consensus that actually they were not that much keen on implementing this social justice agenda. It only changes with 80s and 90s, where you have people from the backward communities, the OBC communities, coming to power in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar and Madhya Pradesh. Then you have UP getting a Dalit woman as the chief minister. And these kind of changes did result in some kind of redistribution. But other than that, actually, what we see is that, I mean, honestly speaking, right now, I don't have a good answer. The only answer one will actually have to look for is do a comparative exercise of 40 years of one political party and 40 years of one political party and see actually who is doing better. And only then we can conclude that, the political ideology really matters as far as implementation is concerned.
It's more or less agnostic to political ideology. It depends on the implementation will, that whether the political will is there or not.
Yeah.
And so, do you find any is there any link, for example, in southern states, especially in Tamil Nadu, there is a delimitation exercise which they're quite pushing for, the and it is also, I feel, somewhat linked to the census, to the population. So, is there any link to that, or it is a completely mutually independent events? Like they are independent events, they are not really linked to the census. So, how do you see that aspect?
See, because the current government has declared that they want to do this delimitation exercise, the southern state is obviously more concerned about this. Because if the population is taken as a unit in terms of dividing the number of seats for the parliament, they are at loss.
Right.
Because it's also that they are being punished for actually following the population policies. In a way, they have followed those policies. They are doing far better in terms of population. They're also doing economically.
Right.
But then it's like punishing them for actually being good in
Yeah.
some way. So that is their argument as far as southern states are concerned. But as far as regional dimensions are concerned, obviously, if they are going to be very smaller in parliament, then they will not, because then any political party will have to focus their energies only on 3 or 4 states in the north or the west, and then they're sorted with politics. They don't have to really pay attention to the south, whether they are supporting one political party or not. And that is, of course, their cause of concern, especially states like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, which have good amount of seats in the parliament, and they would like to actually have their say in the parliament. So delimitation, I mean, what are the ways one can do? What are the ways one can actually balance this political representation problem? That needs to be really discussed, because that unevenness will also have problems. It will produce newer kind of problems. So in some sense, of course, it is connected, because census will become the point for delimitation. But then how do we do it? That is a cause of concern for the South as well. A major concern, I must say.
Coming to one point on the data governance, or maybe the data which we collect. So, in terms of transparency, or maybe in terms of the governance of the data, how important do you think that this data, to what extent can it be made public? Like, maybe do you see that if the data is made public a lot, it gives them more transparency, or part of it can be with the state and the part can be revealed. So, what do you think about this topic in general, that about the data governance part?
I think the data, I mean, it's a census data, and so far all the census data have been in public.
Okay.
And especially, this is actually a good question, because this is a dimension which is less discussed in the public discourse, which is that once the data is made public, it is not the common people who are going to sit and do statistical calculations.
Correct.
This is the work of scholars, this is the work of economists, this is the work of sociologists, and they are the ones who are going to use the data to understand the social change, economic change, social mobility or immobility, so whether some people are doing well or not. And this is a exercise which is very important for scholars as well. And it is not just about, as I said, of course, we talked about the social justice part, we talked about various other things, but data is also used by scholars. And that is actually a very important source of information, because in academia as well, there are scholars who make like bigger statements without having any access to bigger like authentic statistical data. And that is a problem. Something like this famous argument that consistently runs across decades, that caste will dissolve, it will weaken, wither away the moment you have more industrialization and urbanization. Okay, which is fine. It's an assumption, but it needs to be tested. And one of the ways of testing is to have good amount of data for us. Then one can do an analysis and say, okay, well, it is actually, it doesn't matter for some people, it matters for some. Can everybody do all kinds of occupations? These are the questions that can be addressed through these kind of data. And I think within the scholarly world as well, one thing which I must highlight here that the government of India decided to not have caste, as a column in their surveys or census, which is understandable. Okay, whatever they took as a political decision. But you have a large army of scholars who also decided not to use or collect that data. And therefore, we have a big problem with that kind of knowledge production as well. Because it has to be made public, because at the end of the day, this is a public data.
Yeah.
Let me come to the second part here, which is what are the other source? You go to elections and you have a booth level voting data, which means as a political representative or from that region, you will know that which particular area has not voted for you. It goes to a very micro level.
Mm.
And therefore, political parties, all of political parties, if they are, resourceful, they already have a good idea who is voting for them and who is not voting for them.
Right.
Through the electoral rolls, they also know which group lives where in some way, in a broadly speaking. In any way, it's a segregated society, you already have. And in fact, any political party, if it has to be successful, they have to have a good command over the social configurations, that which groups lives where, so that they can actually give tickets to those groups and then make sure that candidate has a chances to win that election. And so as a political party, they already have that information by and large in like broader crude terms. Now it's only this information that will come out which will more or less state the obvious. It's not that as if this is going to change something fundamentally, our understanding of
Right.
society. But it will only give authenticity to different kind of claims that are made. And it's also important for governance. Of course, when it comes to governance, the state can use to also create problems for certain population. But also the same data can be used by those groups which are left behind to make a bigger claim, and which is what a liberal democracy allows. That any population should not be left behind in any terms, and therefore it can compel the government to make some better policies.
Yes, sir. As you said, especially on the as you said, the economists and the sociologists and other scholars can use it. I think that is very critical because not only for political purpose, that data, as you said, that certain jobs are for which communities are not doing certain jobs. Maybe, for example, women are not into certain sectors, or maybe certain marginalized communities are in certain sectors. So that gives a very unique insight, which is, I mean, very good for even for employment, and these are quite crucial for employment generation and other aspects. That is, yeah, it is.
Yeah. So one can also do targeted policies, that if you know that it is certain groups require more kind of skilling or more kind of other kind of resources, the companies can actually benefit. So it has actually benefits on various fronts. It's not just about, one. So we should not also only think about this as only as politics. Of course, politics is there.
Yeah.
And all the developed countries across the world, if you go to United Kingdom, you go to United States, you go to Australia, they are asking your ethnicity.
Yeah.
They record, and nothing has stopped them from actually doing better.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, of course, things are moving up and down, but there are countries which are recording ethnicities, and Indians who are actually maybe averse to talking about caste, they happily record their kind of ethnicity there, and they also benefit from those policies.
Correct.
Because when there are affirmative action policies or diversity policies in the United States, the Indians who might otherwise actually oppose kind of caste enumeration here, they make use of that diversity policies to claim jobs. So I think this is also a contradiction that needs to be talked about at in some other place, I believe. Yeah.
So maybe yes, I think we discussed on a lot of points. But if I were to if you were to sum up, like from a personal standpoint or as a social scientist, in terms of the caste census, if I ask you maybe a top 3 success indicators, you would say, or something, or some sort of key performance indicators, as we say. After this, what kind of outcomes would you as a social scientist would like to see out of this caste census, since it would be a massive exercise and after so many years. So maybe a top 2 or top 3, what comes to your mind?
I think the first, as a researcher myself, I think the first thing I would like to, which I would personally like to see, is what kind of patterns actually emerge from this data exercise. What this data tells us about India as a country itself, in terms of what people are doing, where actually we stand. Now, the second thing where I am thinking, yes, social justice is a very tiny part which will happen. But it will really depend on various groups. What kind of social justice are they seeking? So right now we are only talking in terms of reservations in public sector and maybe even private sector and educational opportunities. But there might be newer ways of seeking social justice. We may not restrict oneself, so we cannot foresee what might happen. But there is also possibility of newer kind of demands rather than having going the same traditional demand, because the society has not remained the same.
Yeah.
Privatization of higher education, absolutely tiny, like negligible jobs in the government. So therefore, that is the second part. The third part is what I actually see is the remapping of political power. That there will be claims on political power. And this is something that will produce newer kind of politics. And that one has to be ready for. Whether one likes or not, any kind of new exercise produces newer kind of politics. Just to give one example, Sachar committee report, it was an exam. It was a big exercise for one particular community, but they had all the information on all the communities. And it did create certain kind of politics among the Muslim community. That there was more focus on social justice aspect rather than only talking about social harmony. And I think that actually opens up door also for political claims, that if certain groups actually are still left behind in terms of political representation or even different kind of representation, that could be talked about. And I think the last part which I would like to highlight is that the Supreme Court has consistently noted that you need authentic data, and they have consistently refused various claims, especially from the other backward classes.
Right.
Okay. And I think also from the dominant castes. So you have the Jats, you have the Marathas, you have the Patidars, you have the Kapu community, you have different dominant castes in the country. They have been also making a claim for separate reservation. And much of these cases have ended up not having any conclusive kind of journey because of lack of authentic data. And I think that will also help to resolve some of these questions.
So yeah, your last point was very interesting. I think remapping, as you say, because there could be newer marginalized castes which could be coming up, and it could be change the political that is very true. Okay, sir, I think thank you for your time. I think it was a great and very insightful discussion. And
thank you, Souvik, for organizing this. I think it's also an important issue, and we need to reach to as many people as possible in terms of this important issue. So thank you for your initiative as well.
Thank you, and thanks for your time. It was really nice.
Thank you.